The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the golden savanna. The air was thick with the earthy scent of dry grass and the faint hum of cicadas. Beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient baobab tree, a crowd had gathered. Their murmurs rippled through the clearing like a restless breeze, each voice tinged with curiosity, disbelief, and anticipation. At the center of it all stood Amina, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face a mask of defiance and unease. Beside her, clutching her hand as if it were his lifeline, was her 6-year-old son, Jabari. Jabari was an unusual child, bright-eyed and curious, with a mop of unruly curls that seemed to defy gravity. But what set him apart most was the mystery surrounding his father. For years, Amina had refused to speak of him, brushing off questions from neighbors and relatives alike with vague answers or outright silence. Some whispered that she didn't know who the father was. Others speculated that she was protecting someone powerful or dangerous. Whatever the truth, it had become the subject of endless gossip in their small village. And now, standing before them under the watchful gaze of the towering baobab tree, was a man who claimed to be Jabari's father. His name was Kofi, though no one recognized him. He was tall and lean, with skin dark as polished mahogany and eyes that glinted like shards of obsidian. His clothes were simple, a tattered shirt and trousers, but there was an air of quiet authority about him, as if he carried secrets too heavy for words. When he stepped into the clearing, the crowd parted instinctively, creating a path that led straight to Amina. "Is this true?" Amina demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut through the murmuring crowd. "You claim to be Jabari's father?" Kofi nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said simply. "I am." A ripple of shock passed through the onlookers. Whispers erupted, growing louder and more frenzied with each passing second. How could this stranger suddenly appear out of nowhere and make such a bold declaration? And why now, after 6 long years? Amina's jaw tightened. She glanced down at Jabari, who was staring up at Kofi with wide, unblinking eyes. There was something in the boy's gaze, an innocence mixed with awe that made her heart ache. She knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Do you know this man, Jabari?" she asked softly. Jabari shook his head. "No, Mama," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But he looks like me." It was true. Now that they were standing side by side, the resemblance was undeniable. Both shared the same high cheekbones, the same almond-shaped eyes, and even the same slight tilt of their heads when they spoke. It was as if nature itself had stamped its seal of authenticity upon them. For a moment, Amina felt the ground beneath her feet shift. Could it really be possible? Could this man truly be Jabari's father? And if so, where had he been all these years? Why had he abandoned them? Before she could process her thoughts further, Kofi took a step closer. "Amina," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I know I have no right to expect your trust, not after everything, but I need you to hear me out. Please." The sincerity in his tone caught her off guard. Against her better judgment, she nodded curtly. "Fine. Speak." Kofi exhaled deeply, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. 6 years ago, he began. "I left this village because I had no choice. I wasn't running from responsibility. I was trying to protect my family. Yours and mine." He paused, searching Amina's face for any sign of understanding. Finding none, he continued. "There are forces in this world darker than we can imagine. Forces that would stop at nothing to destroy anyone connected to me. I thought leaving was the only way to keep you safe, to keep Jabari safe." The crowd listened in stunned silence. Some exchanged skeptical glances, while others leaned forward eagerly, hanging on Kofi's every word. "And yet here you are." Amina shot back, her voice rising. "After all these years, you just show up and expect us to believe your story? Where were you when Jabari took his first steps? When he said his first word? When he needed a father?" Kofi flinched as if struck. "I wanted to be here," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "Every single day, I thought about coming back, but I couldn't risk it. Not until I knew it was safe. Safe? Amina repeated incredulously. What does that even mean? Safe from what? Kofi hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. Finally, he reached into the pocket of his trousers and pulled out a small object. A smooth, black stone etched with strange symbols. He held it up for everyone to see. This is why I stayed away, he said gravely. This stone is part of something much bigger than any of us. Something dangerous. And if I hadn't kept my distance, it would have put you and Jabari in grave danger. The crowd erupted into murmurs once again. Some dismissed Kofi's explanation as nonsense, while others eyed the stone with a mixture of fascination and fear. Even Amina found herself torn between skepticism and intrigue. What kind of man carried around a mysterious stone and spoke of unseen threats? Was he telling the truth, or was this some elaborate ruse? As if sensing her doubt, Kofi stepped closer still, closing the gap between them. I understand if you don't believe me, he said quietly. But please let me prove it to you. Let me show you that I'm not the man you think I am, the man who abandoned you. I'm the man who loves you both more than anything in this world. Amina opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a sudden commotion broke out at the edge of the clearing. Heads turned as a group of men emerged from the tall grass, their faces grim and purposeful. They wore dark robes that billowed ominously in the wind, and each carried a staff topped with a glowing crystal. At their center was a figure cloaked entirely in black, his features obscured by a hood that cast his face in shadow. The villagers gasped, stepping back instinctively as the newcomers approached. Even Kofi tensed, his hand tightening around the stone in his grasp. You shouldn't have come back, the hooded figure said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Kofi's expression hardened as he stepped protectively in front of Amina and Jabari. The crowd, sensing the tension escalating, began to disperse slowly, their murmurs fading into an uneasy silence. Only a few brave souls lingered at the edges of the clearing, too curious or too fearful to leave entirely. The hooded figure raised a hand, halting his companions as they fanned out around him. His glowing crystal staff pulsed faintly with an eerie blue light that seemed to cast long, distorted shadows across the ground. You've meddled enough, he continued, his voice low but carrying a weight that made every word feel like a threat. Do you really think your presence here changes anything? The boy is marked now, whether you like it or not. Marked? Amina echoed, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound defiant. She tightened her grip on Jabari's hand, pulling him closer to her side. What are you talking about? What have you done to my son? The hooded man tilted his head slightly, studying her with an unsettling calmness. We haven't done anything yet, but the stone Kofi carries, it's tied to forces far beyond your understanding. And because of him, the boy has been drawn into this web. There's no escaping it. Jabari looked up at his mother, confusion etched across his young face. Mama, what does he mean? What's happening? Amina knelt beside him again, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. Her hands shook, but she forced herself to smile reassuringly. It's going to be okay, Jabari. I promise. Though her words were meant to comfort him, they sounded hollow even to her own ears. Kofi took another step forward, positioning himself squarely between the intruders and his family. If anyone's responsible for putting them in danger, it's me, he said firmly, addressing the hooded figure. Leave them out of this. Whatever vendetta you have, it's with me. The hooded man chuckled darkly, the sound sending shivers down everyone's spines. Oh, how noble of you, he sneered. But you're wrong. This isn't just about you anymore. The moment you returned, you sealed their fate. You see, the stone chooses its bearer, and once chosen, there's no turning back. Your son. He pointed the tip of his staff toward Jabari, causing the boy to flinch. Is part of this now.
No.
Amina shouted, stepping forward despite Kofi's attempts to hold her back. You don't get to decide that. He's just a child. For the first time, the hooded man's composure faltered. His glowing eyes narrowed, and the light emanating from his staff flickered violently. "A child?" he repeated, his tone dripping with disdain. "He's more than that. Can't you feel it? The energy radiating off him? He's special, unique. And we need him." Before anyone could react, one of the robed men raised his staff, pointing it directly at Jabari. A beam of blinding light shot forth, striking the ground mere inches from where the boy stood. The impact sent a shockwave through the clearing, knocking several people off their feet. Panic erupted as villagers scrambled to flee, their screams filling the air. Kofi acted quickly, grabbing both Amina and Jabari and pulling them behind the thick trunk of the Baobab tree. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice urgent. "Don't move until I tell you it's safe." But Amina started to protest, only to be silenced by the fierce determination in Kofi's eyes. "I'll handle this," he said firmly before turning to face the attackers. Clutching the black stone tightly in his palm, he closed his eyes and whispered something under his breath. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then, the stone began to glow, a deep, pulsating red that grew brighter with each passing second. The air around Kofi shimmered, distorting reality itself as if the fabric of the world was being torn apart. When he opened his eyes again, they burned with the same crimson hue as the stone. Power coursed through him, raw and untamed, and he raised his free hand toward the hooded figure and his followers. "Leave, now," Kofi commanded, his voice resonating with an otherworldly authority. The hooded man hesitated, clearly taken aback by the sudden display of power. But instead of retreating, he smirked, raising his own staff higher. "Impressive," he admitted. "But brute force won't save you or them. You can't fight destiny, Kofi. Sooner or later, the boy will come with us. It's inevitable." With a wave of his hand, the hooded man signaled his followers to retreat. They vanished into the tall grass as swiftly and silently as they had arrived, leaving behind only the faint scent of ozone and the lingering sense of dread. Kofi waited until he was certain they were gone before lowering his arm. The glow in his eyes faded, and the stone dimmed until it was nothing more than a dull, lifeless rock once again. Exhaustion washed over him, and he sank to his knees, breathing heavily. Amina rushed to his side, Jabari clinging to her leg. "Are they gone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now," Kofi replied, his tone grim. "But they'll be back. And next time, they won't stop until they take Jabari." Amina felt her stomach churn at the thought. She looked down at her son, who was staring up at her with wide, frightened eyes. "Why do they want me, Mama?" he asked softly. She didn't have an answer, not one that wouldn't terrify him further. Instead, she hugged him tightly, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "I don't know, sweetheart," she lied, "but I promise, I won't let anyone hurt you." Kofi struggled to his feet, wincing as pain shot through his body. "We need to leave," he said urgently. "This place isn't safe anymore. If we stay, they'll find us again, and next time we might not be so lucky." "Leave," Amina repeated, incredulous. "Where would we go? We can't just abandon our home." "We don't have a choice," Kofi insisted. "They're powerful, Amina, more powerful than you realize. If we stay here, we're sitting ducks. Please, trust me on this." Trust. The word hung heavy in the air between them. After everything that had happened, could Amina truly trust him? Could she risk taking Jabari away from the only life he'd ever known based solely on Kofi's word? As if sensing her hesitation, Jabari tugged gently on her sleeve. "Mama," he said, his voice small but resolute. "I trust him." Amina looked from her son to Kofi, seeing the desperation and love in both their eyes. Slowly, she nodded. "All right," she said finally. "We'll go. But if you're lying to us, Kofi—" "I'm not," he interrupted, his gaze unwavering. "I swear it." With that, the three of them gathered what little belongings they could carry and set off into the unknown, leaving behind the safety of their village and the ominous shadow of the Baobab tree. Little did they know, their journey was only beginning. Far greater dangers awaited them beyond the horizon, and the truth about Jabari's connection to the mysterious stone would soon unravel secrets older than time itself. The trio moved swiftly through the savannah, their footsteps muffled by the dry grass that swayed gently in the night breeze. The moon hung low, casting a silvery glow over the landscape, but its light offered little comfort. Shadows danced ominously around them, and every rustle of leaves or distant animal call seemed to echo with an underlying menace. Amina clutched Jabari's hand tightly, her heart pounding in rhythm with their hurried pace, while Kofi led the way, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. They had been walking for hours, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the village. Kofi had chosen a path that wound through dense thickets and rocky outcrops, areas where they could easily hide if needed. But despite his apparent confidence, Amina couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every so often, she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the hooded figures emerging from the darkness. So far, there was nothing, but the absence of pursuit only made her more uneasy. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Kofi slowed his pace and motioned for them to stop. They had reached a secluded grove surrounded by towering acacia trees, their branches forming a natural canopy above. It was a small sanctuary, hidden from view and shielded from prying eyes. Kofi knelt down, brushing aside some leaves to reveal a patch of soft earth. "We'll rest here for now," he said quietly. "It's safe, at least for tonight." Amina sank to the ground, pulling Jabari close to her. The boy yawned, exhaustion finally overtaking him, and within moments, his head lolled against her shoulder as he drifted off to sleep. She wrapped her arms around him protectively, watching as Kofi busied himself gathering firewood. Despite everything, she couldn't help but notice how different he looked now compared to when he'd first appeared under the Baobab tree. Gone was the mysterious stranger who had claimed to be Jabari's father. In his place was a man burdened by guilt and fear, yet driven by an unyielding determination to protect those he loved. Once the fire was lit, Kofi sat across from Amina, the flickering flames casting shadows across his face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The crackling of the fire and the soft snores of Jabari filled the silence, until finally, Amina broke it. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice firm but tinged with weariness. "No more secrets. If we're going to survive this, I need to know what we're up against." Kofi hesitated, staring into the fire as if searching for the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured, each sentence carefully weighed. "You remember the stone I showed you earlier?" he began. "That wasn't just a random object I picked up. It's called the Heartstone, and it's tied to an ancient power older than any of us can comprehend." Amina frowned, leaning forward slightly. "Ancient power? What does that even mean?" "It means," Kofi continued, "that the Heartstone is one of 7 relics scattered across this land. Each relic holds a fragment of something primordial, something that predates humanity itself. Together, they form what some call the Nexus, a source of unimaginable energy capable of reshaping reality." Amina blinked, trying to process what he was saying. "So, these stones, they're like keys to unlocking this Nexus?" "In a way, yes," Kofi nodded. "But it's not that simple. The relics aren't meant to be used lightly. They're bound by rules, laws put in place by those who created them to prevent chaos. However," he paused, his expression darkening, "there are people, or rather beings, who believe those rules are meant to be broken. Beings who will stop at nothing to gather all 7 relics and unleash the full potential of the Nexus." "And the man in the hood?" Amina prompted, piecing things together. "He's one of them?" Kofi nodded grimly. "His name is Malachi, or at least that's what he calls himself now. He leads a group known as the Obsidian Order. Their goal is to collect the relics and use the Nexus to reshape the world according to their vision. To them, the cost doesn't matter. Lives, civilizations, it's all expendable if it means achieving ultimate power." Amina shuddered at the thought. "And Jabari, why do they want him?" Kofi sighed heavily, running a hand over his face. Because of the connection between the Heartstone and your son. You saw how Malachi reacted when he sensed Jabari's presence. That's because Jabari isn't just an ordinary child. He's a conduit.
A conduit.
Amina echoed, her brow furrowing in confusion. Yes, Kofi explained. Some individuals are born with a unique link to the relics. They can sense them, interact with them, and even amplify their power. It's rare, extremely rare, but it happens. And Jabari, he's one of them. His connection to the Heartstone makes him invaluable to the Obsidian Order. With him, they can locate and control the other relics much more easily. Amina felt a chill run down her spine. All this time, she had thought Jabari was simply a bright, curious child. Now she realized he was something far greater and far more vulnerable. So what happens if they find him? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kofi's jaw tightened. If they capture him, they'll use him to track down the remaining relics. Once they have all 7, they'll attempt to activate the Nexus. And if they succeed, he trailed off, shaking his head. Let's just say the consequences would be catastrophic. Silence fell between them once again, broken only by the occasional pop of the fire. Amina stared at her sleeping son, her mind racing with questions and fears. How could she possibly protect him from such a threat? What chance did they stand against an organization as powerful and ruthless as the Obsidian Order? As if sensing her turmoil, Kofi leaned forward, his gaze locking onto hers. I know this is overwhelming, he said softly. Believe me, I wish none of this had ever happened. But it has, and now we have no choice but to face it head-on. I won't let anything happen to either of you, not again. Tears welled up in Amina's eyes, though she fought to keep them at bay. Why didn't you tell me sooner? She asked, her voice trembling. All those years ago, when you left, why didn't you explain any of this? I wanted to, Kofi admitted, his own voice thick with emotion. But I couldn't risk it. The less you knew, the safer you were. At the time, I believed staying away was the best way to protect you. Clearly, I was wrong. He gestured toward Jabari, who stirred slightly in his sleep. Look at him, Amina. Look at what we've brought into this world. He deserves better than this, a life free from fear and danger. And I intend to give that to him, no matter what it takes. Amina wiped at her eyes, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Then we fight, she said firmly. Together. Kofi smiled faintly, a glimmer of hope returning to his weary eyes. Together. For the first time since the confrontation under the Baobab tree, Amina felt a spark of resolve ignite within her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever dangers awaited them, they would face them as a family. Because that's what they were now, bound not just by blood, but by love and determination. Unbeknownst to them, however, the Obsidian Order was already closing in. Hidden among the shadows of the savannah, Malachi watched the trio from afar, his glowing crystal staff pulsing faintly in the darkness. Patience, he murmured to himself, a sinister grin spreading across his face. Soon enough, the boy will be ours. The night deepened, and the savannah grew eerily quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The fire in the grove crackled softly, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill that lingered in the air. Amina sat awake, her back resting against the rough bark of an acacia tree, while Jabari slept peacefully beside her, curled up like a small animal seeking refuge. Kofi, meanwhile, paced restlessly at the edge of their makeshift camp, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Amina. Her mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. She replayed Kofi's words over and over in her head. The Heartstone, the Nexus, the Obsidian Order. It all sounded like something out of a myth, yet she couldn't deny the truth staring her in the face. Jabari was special, chosen by forces beyond comprehension. And because of that, they were being hunted. Her gaze drifted to Kofi, who had stopped pacing and now stood motionless, staring into the distance. His silhouette was sharp against the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the trees. For the first time since he'd reappeared in her life, she allowed herself to really look at him. not just as the man claiming to be Jabari's father, but as someone carrying a burden far heavier than she could have imagined. "Do you think they're close?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. Kofi didn't turn around immediately. When he did, his expression was grim. "They're always close," he replied. "Malachi isn't the type to give up easily. He knows how important Jabari is to their plans. They'll come for him sooner or later." Amina swallowed hard, clutching the fabric of her skirt tightly in her fists. "And when they do, what then?" Kofi hesitated before answering. "We fight. We run. We do whatever it takes to keep them away from Jabari." His voice softened slightly. "But I won't lie to you, it won't be easy. The Obsidian Order has resources we can't even begin to imagine. Their followers are everywhere, watching, waiting. So we're just supposed to keep running forever?" Amina snapped, frustration bubbling to the surface. "There has to be another way, Kofi. Some way to end this once and for all." Kofi crouched down beside her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "There is," he said quietly. "But it's risky, dangerous even. If we want to stop them, we need to find the other relics before they do. Each relic contains a fragment of the Nexus, and together, they hold the key to stopping Malachi permanently." Amina frowned. "How does finding the relics help us? Wouldn't that just make it easier for them to activate the Nexus?" "No," Kofi explained, "because the relics also contain safeguards, ancient mechanisms designed to prevent anyone from misusing their power. If we gather the relics first, we can use those safeguards to seal the Nexus completely. Once sealed, it becomes inaccessible to everyone, including the Obsidian Order." It sounded simple enough in theory, but Amina knew better than to believe it would be easy. "And where do we start?" she asked skeptically. "Do you even know where the other relics are?" Kofi shook his head. "Not exactly, but the Heartstone will guide us. It's already connected to Jabari, which means it can lead us to the others. We just need to follow its energy." Before Amina could respond, a sudden rustling sound came from the bushes nearby. Both she and Kofi froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise. Slowly, Kofi rose to his feet, reaching instinctively for the Heartstone tucked inside his pocket. The rustling grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable snap of twigs underfoot. "Stay here," Kofi whispered urgently, stepping forward cautiously. "Keep Jabari safe." Amina nodded, though her heart was pounding wildly. She gently shook Jabari awake, covering his mouth with her hand to muffle any startled cries. "Shoo, sweetheart," she murmured. "It's okay. Just stay quiet." Jabari blinked sleepily, his wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Mama?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's all right," she reassured him, pulling him closer. "We're safe." Out in the clearing, Kofi stood poised, ready for whatever or whoever might emerge from the shadows. As the rustling grew louder, a figure stepped into the dim light of the fire. To Amina's relief, it wasn't one of the hooded men from earlier. Instead, it was an elderly woman, her frail frame draped in colorful shawls that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Her hair was streaked with gray, and her face bore the lines of someone who had lived many lifetimes. In her hands, she held a staff adorned with feathers and beads, each charm tinkling softly as she moved. "Who are you?" Kofi demanded, his tone wary but not hostile. The old woman smiled warmly, her eyes twinkling with wisdom. "I am Akojua," she said, her voice gentle yet commanding. "And I've been waiting for you." "For me?" Kofi repeated, taken aback. Akojua nodded, approaching slowly until she stood directly in front of him. She studied him intently, her gaze piercing yet kind. "You carry the Heartstone," she observed. "That makes you, and your family, a part of something much greater than yourselves. How do you know about the Heartstone?" Kofi asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. "I've walked this path before," Akojua replied cryptically. "Long ago, I was tasked with protecting one of the relics. Now, it seems my journey has led me back to aid you in yours." Kofi exchanged a glance with Amina, who still clutched Jabari protectively. "Why should we trust you?" he asked bluntly. Kojua chuckled softly. "Trust is earned, not given freely. But know this, I share your goal. The Nexus must remain sealed, or the balance of this world will be destroyed. Together we stand a chance. Alone." She let the sentence hang unfinished, her meaning clear. After a moment of deliberation, Kofi nodded reluctantly. "Fine, you can help us. But if you betray us, you'll have no reason to doubt my loyalty," Akojua interrupted, her tone firm. "Now tell me what you know so far. Time is short, and the Obsidian Order grows stronger with each passing day." As Kofi began recounting their story, Amina felt a flicker of hope reignite within her. Perhaps they weren't as alone in this fight as she'd feared. With Akojua's guidance, maybe, just maybe, they stood a chance against Malachi and his followers. But as dawn broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the savannah, none of them realized that the true test of their resolve was only beginning. The first light of dawn painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, but the beauty of the sunrise was lost on Amina, Kofi, Jabari, and Akojua. They had spent the remaining hours of the night strategizing, piecing together fragments of ancient lore, and mapping out a plan to locate the other relics before the Obsidian Order could reach them. Akojua's knowledge proved invaluable. She spoke of hidden temples, forgotten ruins, and sacred sites where the relics were said to reside. Each location was fraught with peril, guarded by traps and trials designed to test the worthiness of those who sought the Nexus. As they prepared to leave the grove, Akojua handed Kofi a small pouch containing herbs and charms. "These will protect you from dark energies," she explained. "But remember, no charm can shield you from your own doubts or fears. Trust in yourselves and in each other." With that, the group set off toward their first destination, the Temple of Echoes, a crumbling structure nestled deep within the heart of the savannah. According to Akojua, it housed the second relic, a crystal shard imbued with the essence of sound. The journey would take days, and every step brought them closer to both salvation and danger. By midday, the heat became unbearable, the sun blazing mercilessly overhead. Jabari trudged along bravely, though his small legs struggled to keep pace. Amina walked beside him, offering words of encouragement whenever he faltered. Kofi led the way, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for threats, while Akojua brought up the rear, her staff tapping rhythmically against the ground as if keeping time with some unseen melody. It wasn't long before they encountered their first obstacle. As they approached a narrow ravine, the air grew colder, and an unnatural stillness settled over the landscape. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, even in the bright sunlight, and the faint sound of whispers echoed around them. "They're here," Kofi muttered under his breath, gripping the heartstone tightly. Sure enough, figures emerged from the shadows. Hooded men and women, their faces obscured, each carrying glowing crystal staves identical to Malachi's. At their center stood Malachi himself, his presence commanding and suffocating. His crimson eyes locked onto Jabari, and a cruel smile spread across his face. "Impressive," Malachi drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "You've managed to evade us this long, but your luck ends here." Kofi stepped forward, positioning himself between Malachi and his family. "You'll have to go through me first," he growled, the heartstone glowing faintly in his hand. Malachi chuckled darkly. "Oh, I intend to." With a wave of his staff, the ground beneath them trembled violently. Cracks split open, forcing the group to scatter. The Obsidian Order advanced, their movements synchronized like a well-oiled machine. Chaos erupted. Kofi unleashed bursts of energy from the Heartstone, sending waves of crimson light crashing into their attackers. Akojua raised her staff, chanting incantations that summoned protective barriers of shimmering light. Amina grabbed Jabari and pulled him behind a boulder, shielding him from the chaos unfolding around them. "Stay close to me," Amina urged, clutching Jabari tightly. Despite their efforts, the odds were overwhelming. For every attacker they felled, two more took their place. Just as hope began to wane, Jabari suddenly stood up, his young face etched with determination. He reached out instinctively, his palm glowing with a soft, golden light. The glow intensified, spreading outward in a radiant pulse that forced the attackers back. "What's happening?" Amina gasped, staring at her son in awe. "It's the conduit," Akojua breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. "He's awakening," Malachi snarled in frustration, raising his staff to counteract the surge of energy. But before he could act, Kofi seized the opportunity. Channeling all his strength into the Heartstone, he unleashed a final, devastating blast of power that sent Malachi and his followers retreating into the shadows. For a moment there was silence. Then, slowly, the tension eased, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The group regrouped, battered but alive. "We did it," Amina whispered, tears streaming down her face as she hugged Jabari tightly. "For now," Kofi corrected grimly. "This isn't over. Malachi won't stop until he has what he wants." Akojua nodded solemnly. "But today we've proven something important. Together we are stronger than any force that seeks to divide us. Keep moving forward, and trust in the bond you share." With renewed resolve, the group pressed onward, their hearts heavy but resolute. Days turned into weeks as they navigated treacherous terrains, solved intricate puzzles, and faced unimaginable dangers. Along the way, they collected the remaining relics, each one bringing them closer to sealing the Nexus permanently. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the final site, the Nexus altar, a colossal stone monolith surrounded by 7 pedestals. One by one, they placed the relics onto the pedestals, their combined energies creating a blinding vortex of light and sound. As the last relic clicked into place, the ground quaked violently, and a deafening roar filled the air. From the vortex emerged Malachi, his form distorted and monstrous, his power amplified by desperation. "You think you can stop me?" he roared, his voice echoing like thunder. "I am eternal." But Jabari stepped forward, his small frame radiating with the combined energy of the relics. His eyes glowed golden, and his voice carried a wisdom far beyond his years. "No more," he declared firmly. "Your greed ends here." With a final surge of energy, Jabari channeled the full might of the Nexus into a single, concentrated beam of light. It struck Malachi, disintegrating him instantly and sealing the Nexus forever. When the dust settled, the altar lay silent, its power neutralized. Exhausted but victorious, the group embraced, knowing they had saved not only themselves but the entire world. As they made their way back home, the weight of their journey lingered, but so did the joy of newfound unity. They weren't just survivors. They were a family bound by love, courage, and the unbreakable spirit of a little boy who had changed the course of destiny. And beneath the vast African sky, they knew peace had finally been restored. The END.